Hello, Mr. Smith here with 7th Hour U.S. History class. Today we're going to take a look at the election of 1964. Looking back at elections can be instructive because you wonder why the voters chose who they chose. Why did President Johnson win the election of 1964? What did people see in him? Why did they vote for him? Let's find out. Let's take a look at the elections of 1964. The incumbent, the guy who was already president in 1964, is Lyndon Johnson. He became president the previous year, 1963, when President Kennedy died. So Johnson had been the vice president. President Kennedy died, and then Johnson became president. So he had only been president for 1 year before this election. He would be challenged by Barry Goldwater, a senator from Arizona. Lyndon Johnson was fairly popular in 1964 for a couple of reasons. First of all, because President Kennedy had been very popular and Johnson was Kennedy's vice president, Kennedy's popularity kind of rubbed off onto Johnson. Secondly, the economy was going well, and that usually makes a president popular. So people had jobs, they had good paying jobs, and they could buy lots of things and have a good standard of living. So Johnson was well positioned for the 1964 election. Barry Goldwater, challenging Johnson, was a variously described as conservative or libertarian. He wanted to reduce the size of government. He wanted to get the government off people's backs, cut taxes, let people not have to live with so much regulations, etc., etc. So he was big in terms of freedom and liberty. He wanted to let the people enjoy their freedom and not have the government try to control them. What were the big issues going on in 1964? The Vietnam War was just getting started, and they had different philosophies about how to deal with the Vietnam War. Johnson favored large amounts of ground troops. Barry Goldwater wanted to take an approach of using mainly air power and bombing and thereby not risk as many lives. Johnson wanted soldiers on the ground, and that would lead to more casualties. So that was one of the big issues in 64. The campaign featured Johnson. Hubert Humphrey was the vice presidential candidate. Johnson and Humphrey were kind of represented a new look for the Democrat Party. They were two of the Democrats who had been willing to oppose segregation. They were two Democrats who had been willing to look at integration and desegregation. They faced resistance within their own party. Their fellow Democrats, many of them still wanted segregation. So that was an issue inside the Democrat Party. But Johnson and Humphrey were the nominees. Goldwater was well received. A lot of people liked Goldwater. A few people accused him, however, of being too extreme. And one of his famous quotes that you will either love or hate, he talked about extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. Goldwater's idea is that you can't have too much freedom. You can't have too much liberty. Liberty and freedom are good things, and therefore there is no such thing as too much. It's okay to be extreme if you're extreme about freedom and liberty. And the pursuit of justice, if you really want justice, then you can be extreme in pursuing justice. So some people loved Goldwater, some people hated Goldwater, and it was this idea of extremism which made some people not like him. His vice presidential candidate was William Miller. This is a guy that you'll never hear of. He kind of is a trivial pursuit question in terms of history. Nobody knew much about him and still doesn't. So we'll just move on. Bottom line is that Johnson is going to win by a landslide. Um, we see not just a little bit of a win, but there was a overwhelming win. Johnson begins his first full term in office uh, in with very strong numbers, and everybody's happy about Johnson. If you take a look at the map here, you'll see the only places that didn't go for Johnson were those southern states that still wanted segregation. They had nominated alternative Democrat candidates. They didn't want to vote for Johnson. They also didn't want to vote for Goldwater. So Johnson captured nearly the whole nation. What's going to be the results of this election? The massive escalation of the Vietnam War. Lyndon Johnson will send over 500,000 U.S. soldiers into the war. That's going to end up causing problems later on. Johnson also launched a bunch of anti-poverty programs. Unfortunately, they were not very effective. That's a long story, but a lot of times anti-poverty programs can actually cause poverty, and that was what's part of Johnson's legacy. Those first two items, the Vietnam War and the anti-poverty programs, cost a lot of money. So what do we get next? We get massive national debt. Federal government is spending way too much money, and taxes go up. All because Lyndon Johnson won the '64 election. So we're going to see Johnson goes from being very popular to very unpopular. The young people are not going to be happy at all. They're being drafted, sent to Vietnam against their will, where many of them will be wounded, and they're protesting in the streets. Lyndon Johnson, the longer he was in office, the more people began to understand what he was really about, and he was a crude and rude person. I'm not going to talk about it, but you can Google it and find some incredibly bizarre things that he did. So between his personality being crude and rude, his tragic loss of American life in Vietnam, and some other ineffectual programs and spending lots of money, 4 years later, by 1968, Johnson knew that he had zero chance, so he didn't even try to get reelected. So in 4 years, from '64 to '68, he goes from being insanely popular to being so unpopular that he didn't even bother to try to get elected again. And that is the story of the 1964 election. So lots and lots of people voted for President Johnson in 1964. Huge numbers of people voted for him. He won by a landslide. But the people who voted for him soon regretted it. Soon they were not happy with him. And so they turned around 4 years later, and he was no longer president, and they found somebody else.